Helen Mirren stepped onto the Shakespearean stage, embodied as queens and princesses, figures whose historical power was placed directly onto the actor's body. Yet that power existed only for the instant the lights came up, performed, temporarily borrowed, then returned when the curtain fell. When the performance ended, the system remained fixed at its old distance. Her ability was acknowledged, but she was rarely positioned where acceptance came easily. For many years afterward, Mirren kept appearing very near the center. Her presence was too unmistakable to become a safe image, not soft enough to soothe the public, not faint enough to be reduced to a familiar mold. She was there, close to power, but outside its zone of comfort. Only much later did a role arrive, one in which composure, distance, and the weight accumulated over time were no longer obstacles, but necessary conditions. There was no sudden turning point, only time continuing to pass, gradually revealing why a peak reached late could nonetheless stand firm. That distance did not emerge late. It was present very early, even before power had time to take a clear shape in her life. Helen Mirren was born in 1945 in Hammersmith, London, into a Britain just emerging from war with a clear demand: stability, order, and lives that could function without causing further disturbance. Her family did not belong to the social center of that world, but neither did they stand at its margins. They lived with enough discipline not to collapse, and enough silence not to attract attention. Within the post-war British social structure, that position carried a very specific meaning. Not part of the elite to be shielded by tradition, yet not marginal enough to be read as a voice of resistance. Mirren grew up in a space where one's presence had to be proper, but was never taken for granted. Entering the system, therefore, became an active act. One did not wait to be called by name. Helen's father, Vasily Mironov, carried an origin that no longer had usable value. His Russian aristocratic background, severed after the revolution, did not become a family legend, nor was it recounted as a loss demanding sympathy. In England, he drove a taxi for a living, imposing discipline on everyday life as the only way to maintain order. Power in his eyes was not something to revere. It was something that had once collapsed and therefore did not deserve romanticization. That skeptical spirit existed in the household not as discourse, but as habit. No faith in symbols, no reliance on titles, no expectation of favor from the system. Her mother, Kathleen Rogers, operated life according to a different rhythm: quiet, steady, and non-negotiable. Labor was not framed as sacrifice, but as something that had to be done each day. In that space, no one was encouraged to become special, and there was no room for demanding attention. Children grew up with schedules, duties, and being in the right place at the right time. Emotions were not forbidden, but they were not placed at the center. In that house, there were no long conversations meant to explain or console. Things were handled through timetables, tasks, and days passing in proper sequence. In 1951, the family changed their surname from Mironov to Mirren. This was not a rejection of origin, but an adjustment for survival in a society where a name could determine the degree of acceptance. Less evocative, less likely to provoke questions. From very early on, Mirren became accustomed to altering outward form in order to keep moving forward, not to seek affection, but to keep the path from being closed. Her childhood in Essex unfolded within a disciplined environment that did not indulge emotion. Art was not positioned as a special calling. Acting appeared early in the form of something that needed to be done, rather than a dream to be encouraged. The household's severity made art appear as responsibility, not refuge. After secondary school, Helen studied at the New College of Speech and Drama in London, a small, exacting training space without glamour. There were only rehearsal rooms, voices corrected syllable by syllable, and young bodies learning how to exist under the gaze of others without being allowed to lean on immediate emotion. Every deviation was immediately visible. A final consonant, not properly closed, stripped a line of its weight. Breath falling out of rhythm disrupted tempo. A single unnecessary movement was enough to skew the space. There were no long compliments or interpretive critiques, only stopping, adjusting, and repeating until the body itself found its place. What was forged there did not align with what is commonly called British restraint. It was not repression to preserve dignity, but precision sufficient not to interrupt a functioning structure. That restraint aimed at the capacity to remain, over time, within a space that did not permit deviation. When stepping onto larger stages, the impression left was not familiar reserve, but a tension that had not been softened. In that environment, no one demanded stillness. But when attention was sufficiently focused, all unnecessary movement became surplus on its own. Rehearsals passed in that manner. Few words, much repetition, leaving behind a form of presence accustomed to maintaining its own shape within shared space. That form of presence first stepped onto the stage in 1965. On the platform of the National Youth Theatre, Helen Mirren appeared as a force placed directly into the performance space. Cleopatra was carried onto the actor's body, in breath, in movement, in a degree of agency strong enough to unsettle the familiar sense of safety of the British stage. Power operated in the present tense, not as a symbol to be observed, but as an action in progress. The audience had almost no time to step back. Reactions came quickly, but without time to stabilize. The role was widely discussed, yet its reception carried a lingering wariness. In the context of British theatre in the mid-1960s, young actresses entering spaces of power were generally expected to maintain a proper distance. Mirren's appearance, therefore, was not entirely smooth. After the performance, the role was frequently mentioned, but responses were not unified. There was a tension, there was praise for ability, and there was also a prolonged silence, where a presence that came too close was not easily placed within familiar frames. There were no public controversies, no official objections, but subsequent choices for Mirren began to carry caution. Introductions became more careful. Opportunities came with unspoken limits. She continued to be seen, but was not always retained as a safe form in which the system could place long-term trust. When Mirren joined the Royal Shakespeare Company in 1966, technique was not the issue. Diction, rhythm, syntactic structure, and the ability to hold the stage all met the demands of a system built on long-established standards. At the same time, the queens, princesses, and historically powerful figures Mirren played did not remain at the level of representation. The actor's body did not dissolve into the role in the customary way. It stayed with its own weight, making power impossible to receive as an abstract concept. The distance required to feel safe was not always maintained. Within the same space, many actresses of her generation sustained stability by allowing the image to lead the audience's emotion. Mirren did not choose that path. Power was neither softened nor concealed behind ritual. This did not provoke explosive reactions, but it was enough to make reception cautious. Acknowledgments of ability were often accompanied by a pause, where the role was seen, but not easily allowed to become a long-term anchor for a stable trajectory. That wariness did not surface as immediate conflict. It accumulated in criticism, in the way roles were introduced, in the fact that Mirren appeared consistently, yet was rarely retained as a norm. By 1974, when she publicly criticized the Royal Shakespeare Company and the National Theatre for technical display and a lack of character depth, the reaction extended beyond the stage. The press joined in, and the issue was raised in Parliament. Not because the content of her remarks was extreme, but because the speaker did not occupy the position usually expected of a dissenting voice. Leaving the stage did not mean entering an easier space. British cinema at the end of the 1960s opened as a zone of experimentation, freer in form, but also quicker to confine in reception. The camera preserved what the stage allowed to pass, and for Mirren, this quickly became a double-edged blade. In Herostratus and Age of Consent, her presence was read by the media as a form of bold eroticism, not so much because of performance as because of how the body was placed within the frame and repeated through posters, articles, and promotional images. Subsequent roles in Oh Lucky Man expanded her range of appearances without altering the basic logic of reception. Cinema offered faster recognition while simplifying the complexity of roles into easily consumed labels. With Caligula, this process reached its limit. The film caused shock not only because of content or imagery, but because its production structure slipped beyond control. When it was released, the boundaries between performance, the use of images, and public discussion became difficult to separate. The media did more than register those roles. They began to build around Mirren an image more consumable than the work itself. Mirren did not respond by withdrawing or adjusting her image. She allowed those readings to exist without changing her body or voice to meet them. The gap between how Mirren was seen and how she continued to work thus became clearer and was not narrowed by compromise. There was no formal hiatus after Caligula, only the sense that the pace of work slowed, as if doors remained open but no longer automatic. Mirren continued to appear, not excluded, but not called to the center. Roles came from projects that offered no shelter, places where the actor had to maintain balance within unstable structures. Entering the 1980s, Helen Mirren's professional life settled into a heavy, extended rhythm. There was no pause to remake an image, and no shift clear enough to feel that she had arrived. Work came steadily, but protection did not. Roles appeared as successive testing grounds, spaces where she had to carry her body and presence into skewed power structures and remain long enough to feel their pressure. During this period, Mirren became accustomed to a very specific form of solitude. Not the isolation of someone abandoned, but the state of a person always correctly placed, yet rarely positioned at the emotional center of the system. She did not respond by retreating or demanding. Instead, she learned to let her presence expose structure, by sustaining silences beyond comfort, by not intervening when the rhythm of power began to crack, by accepting positions without clear rewards. In The Long Good Friday, this state is especially evident. Standing beside Bob Hoskins, Mirren is not built as support or emotional counterweight. Her character holds position while the surrounding order begins to slip, allowing silence to remain long enough for power to reveal itself. This is not a moment of victory, but a choice to stay. A choice not to soften, not to explain, and not to reclaim space. The years that followed offered no relief. Work followed work, across film, stage, and television. Roles were not designed to coalesce into a memorable image or a favorable trajectory. They accumulated differently, slowly, heavily, and with demands for prolonged endurance. Mirren grew accustomed to letting emotion find no quick outlet, to allowing fatigue to remain in the body rather than be released as climax. Under the harshest conditions, wear became a direct experience. The Mosquito Coast offered no position of retreat. The character exists within a closed structure where every response is held back. The camera does not seek release. It records accumulated exhaustion, features thinning, breath slowing, the sensation of being held within a narrowing space from scene to scene. There is no liberation, only staying long enough to see the structure reveal its own decay. It was this sequence of experiences that gradually defined Mirren's place in British cinema. She became an actress capable of carrying characters not written to be liked and not needing to be liked to endure. Critics noted precision and endurance in her performances, but those qualities rarely translated into market advantage. Reputation remained, but not rounded enough to operate as a brand. Mirren continued to work within that offset, not as a challenge to the system, but as a reality accepted very early on. By the end of the decade, everything was pushed to an extreme. Enclosed spaces, violent color, the body seen, placed, compelled to endure, no score to guide emotion, no moral anchor for the viewer to grasp. The camera moves through rooms like a mechanism, carrying an undiminished discomfort. Power appears brutally, not the power of the ruler, but of someone who cannot be broken even when turned into an object. These years did not produce a box office star, nor did they form a chain of successes for the system to exploit over the long term. Work continued to come from directors and projects that did not require Mirren to be more legible in order to sell. Mirren did not change her voice, did not soften. She stayed the course. Discomfort bound to the body, dialogue without cushioning, and scenes that do not allow the viewer to step back far enough to feel safe. In 1991, Helen Mirren entered Prime Suspect not as an image pivot, but as a prolonged test of endurance. Jane Tennison was not introduced to win sympathy. She appears in an environment where mail order is already fully in place. Meeting rooms, crime scenes, promotion procedures, the language of authority. Tennison does not disrupt that order through declarations. She goes straight to the work, drinks heavily, speaks bluntly, does not apologize, does not explain why she belongs there, nor does she promise to become more agreeable once accepted. In the early episodes, the script does not protect the character. Tennison makes mistakes, misjudges situations, is isolated, is spoken about behind her back within her own team. Mirren does not soften these details. She keeps the character under scrutiny, under testing, pushed into situations with no emotional exit. No scene is constructed for redemption. When Tennison is right, she is right through results, not through a softened attitude. When she is wrong, the script leaves the consequences intact. The production of Prime Suspect stretched over many years, with a heavy rhythm and constant pressure from public response. Mirren did not retreat the character into a safe zone even as success came early. On the contrary, with each season, Tennison grows older, more exhausted, less likable. Alcohol does not disappear. Personal relationships continue to collapse. Loneliness is not treated as a tragedy to be soothed. It exists as a cost of the job, paid regularly without negotiation. And it is precisely here that British television allowed this to exist without bending it toward comfort. Prime Suspect did not require a female character to pay through repentance in order to continue existing. Tennison holds power by staying at the crime scene, staying in the meeting room, staying in situations where no one wants to stand. After Prime Suspect, more female characters of this kind appeared. Fewer explanations, less need for redemption, and enough durability to persist long-term in an uncomfortable state. Parallel to television, cinema placed Mirren on a different axis of power. The madness of King George did not ask her to display herself. Queen Charlotte operates through discipline and distance. Mirren does not compete for the center with Nigel Hawthorne. She stands beside him, observes, maintains order as everything around begins to fracture. In this film, power does not lie in speaking more, but in not panicking when the system wavers. Mirren holds that role through a measured tempo, refusing to push emotion forward for effect. With Gosford Park, this mode of working becomes even clearer. A large ensemble cast, a fragmented structure, multiple social strata layered over one another. Mirren plays the housekeeper, a woman who does not need to go upstairs to control the rhythm of the household. She holds authority through schedules, through delegation, through knowing who needs to be slowed down and who can be passed over. The camera does not seek climactic moments from this character. It records operation. And it is precisely that operation that makes the role a structural pillar of the film. Mirren does not need to dominate screen time to be remembered. She remains long enough for the structure to hold. During this period, Mirren begins to maintain distance in a different way. The body is no longer pushed forward to generate force. In its place comes restraint. Holding the gaze, holding position, holding rhythm. The royal roles that follow do not arrive as repetition, but as another test. Can power exist without display? This shift coincides with an aging body, but not in the familiar way. Mirren does not treat age as something to overcome, nor does she turn it into an inspirational narrative. A slower body is kept intact within the working rhythm, not softened through morality or sympathy. Age here does not appear as a message, but as a new working condition, accepted as reality. Elizabeth I answers that question in a cold, durable manner. This is not a beautified Elizabeth. The film does not avoid the harshness of power, nor does it seek balance through emotional life. Mirren portrays a woman who must continually cut away the personal in order to retain position. Political decisions are placed ahead of private feeling. Loneliness is not romanticized. It appears in empty moments, after audiences, in private chambers, when ceremonial garments are removed with no witnesses. Preparation for this role was extensive, involving rigorous historical research and careful discussion about how not to soften the character. Mirren does not attempt to modernize Elizabeth for easier reception. She keeps her distance from the viewer. She does not invite empathy. She does not explain motives through contemporary psychology. Power here is tied directly to long-term endurance, with no emotional reward. By the early 2000s, Mirren enters a different state. Competence is no longer a question she must answer with every appearance. She holds authority over time, not through eruption, not through a run of leading roles, but through appearing in the right place for long enough in projects that do not require her to be more legible. Television and cinema entrust her with characters capable of lasting for years without needing to be liked. In 2006, Helen Mirren entered The Queen at the age of 61. By then, her working rhythm no longer needed to adjust to each project. Her body was accustomed to a slower tempo. Her voice carried the accumulated weight of decades. Every movement belonged to a form that had stabilized long enough to no longer require retesting. The film opens amid a climate of widespread tension, a death that shocks the public, relentless media, collective emotion moving faster than the system's capacity to absorb it. Within that flow, Mirren's character operates on a different rhythm, the rhythm of habits forged over long periods, where reaction always follows observation. Mirren places the character within everyday routines, walking through the forests of Scotland, changing clothes in silence, sitting in a car as crowds press in. These actions are not built for effect. They exist as the structure of a life long accustomed to repetition, where every movement has its place. That repetition creates weight, a form that has existed long enough not to be swept away by external pressure. What the film lingers on most is not the decision itself, but the space before decision. The camera holds on very small moments, a gaze sustained for one more beat, a step slowed along a path, a sentence weighed before being spoken. No private scenes are used to explain interior life. The character exists through hesitation preserved, not discharged through speech. Loneliness in this role does not appear as a state requiring naming. It resides in how life is organized, a person accustomed to operating in silence, confronting a world demanding immediate response. Mirren does not attempt to soften that distance. She allows it to exist as a living condition, where every action must pass through consideration before entering the light. The behind-the-scenes approach mirrors this choice exactly. Stephen Frears maintains distance from overt emotional interpretation. The script does not attempt to soften history. Mirren approaches the character through patient observation. No imitation, no emphasis, no pursuit of closeness. Distance is maintained as part of the structure, not as an attitude. At 61, age is present in the role as a concrete condition of body and rhythm. Speech slows. Reflexes are no longer urgent. That very slowness allows the character to remain upright within a space in flux. Mirren does not need to tense herself to prove competence. The role fits the form already there. No alteration, no elevation required. The most important moment of The Queen arrives when the character steps out before the public. The action is not pushed as an emotional climax. The voice remains even. The face does not search for explanation. The change lies in the decision to appear, not in the words spoken. The old order shifts in silence. The awards that followed, Oscar, BAFTA, Golden Globe, arrived as consequences, not objectives. The Queen stands at the end of a long path where Mirren had held her form long enough to no longer need to perform steadiness. This role does not resemble a proclaimed victory. It resembles a moment of systemic adjustment, when confronted with a form that has stood still long enough to have nothing left to prove. After The Queen, Helen Mirren did not enter a phase of contraction to preserve an image, nor did she use that peak to retreat into safety. Work continued to open up, but at a different tempo. No need to demonstrate power further, no need to avoid the gaze. In 2009, The Last Station placed Helen Mirren beside a legend already occupying the historical center. Tolstoy is the axis of the story, but Mirren's character exists elsewhere, where love, age, and the need for control collide under conditions no longer easy to choose. She is present through a body bearing the marks of time, stepping directly into family conflict without being positioned safely. Every action carries immediate consequence. Every choice exposes tensions accumulated over many years. The role sustains that state until truth reveals itself, without being propped up by justification. Here, Mirren does not build the character through surging emotion. She allows the aging body to participate directly in the conflict. Slower steps, heavier gestures, prolonged silences between two people who have loved long enough that letting go is no longer simple. Fatigue is not separated as a thematic layer. It permeates each scene, each look, making love appear as a state both binding and eroding. The role leaves a heavy, uncomfortable residue, not because it is extreme, but because it is too close to lived reality to be soothed. A year later, Mirren entered Red in an entirely different space. The pace is fast, the tone openly entertaining. The structure runs on broad consumption. Within that environment, Mirren carries the same form long accustomed to bearing pressure. Humor appears as a regulating rhythm, not softening the character, but sharpening her edge. Action sequences are kept at sufficient distance so the body is not turned into a tool for stimulation. Mirren's character in Red does not seek to command attention. She stands within the frame with the precision of someone used to controlling space through presence rather than large movement. Decisive actions, compact reactions, and steady rhythm allow the character to exist within an entertainment structure without being swallowed by it. There, Mirren does not change her form to suit the market. The market must adjust to contain that form. The two projects stand side by side as different tests. One places Mirren within family conflict, where love and possession cannot be separated. The other situates her within entertainment, where speed and laughter govern the narrative rhythm. In both, Mirren holds to one constant: the ability to remain in a role without softening it. That consistency allows her to move through very different structures while preserving a core presence that does not dissolve. Despite working increasingly in the United States, Mirren never became a seamless part of Hollywood, not because of nationality, but because she does not adjust her form to fit the logic of rapid consumption. Even in purely entertaining projects, Mirren maintains the same rhythm of presence: precise, cool, and not inviting affection. Passage through the market thus occurs without complete assimilation. On stage, the audience, during its runs from 2013-2015 in London and 2015-2016 on Broadway, opens yet another space. Not cinema, not memory, a living audience, seated directly before her. Mirren moves across reigns but does not reconstruct history as a chain of climaxes. Meetings unfold in enclosed rooms. The aging body keeps a slow tempo. Power lies not in speech, but in being listened to in silence. Each night's performance is a direct confrontation, with no edit to correct errors. After the peak, Mirren did not narrow the scope of her work. She stepped into stories where decisions cannot be reversed, and those who make them must remain with the consequences. There are scenes that extend simply to hold a state, a gaze that does not waver, a voice that does not rise, a body that remains still as others begin to evade responsibility. No climax offers release. There is only the necessity of saying yes or no, and then continuing to live with that choice. In 2024, the Cecil B. DeMille Award was presented as a belated recognition, not for a single role, but for the capacity to remain over time without shrinking oneself to fit the system. Mirren did not stop there. The work continued, not to prolong a peak, but to affirm that the peak had never been an end point. From this point on, professional authority no longer needed to be proven. What began to be tested instead was the ability to live with it when there were no roles left to shield it. Within relationships without a stage, where distance is not accepted as part of the job. Helen Mirren's early relationships unfolded alongside a period in which she was still finding her footing within the British theater system, a system governed by discipline, tempo, and a non-negotiable presence. Love entered her life not as a refuge, but as something stretched taut between rehearsal schedules, tours, practice rooms, and late returns home. Time was always fragmented. Presence was rarely complete. These relationships did not end because of betrayal or grand tragedy, but because there was not enough space to remain together over the long term. Mirren does not recount those breakups with bitterness, nor does she cast herself as a victim of her career. Yet in the way she speaks of love from that period, one thing is clear. Work did not step aside to make room for intimacy. And she was not willing to compress her own shape in order to preserve a relationship at any cost. Love for Mirren was never a form of salvation. It was a presence that had to withstand the rhythm of real life. And many relationships could not withstand that. There were men who passed through her life during that time who left deep impressions, but did not remain. Not for lack of feeling, but because neither side found a way to exist together long-term, within a life in constant motion. Mirren did not shy away from pleasure, nor did she deny the need for intimacy. But she did not place love at the center in a way that would force her work to change shape. What could not stand within reality, she allowed to leave, without noise, without staging a tragedy, without rewriting the story to make it more comfortable. Her marriage to Taylor Hackford in 1997 marked a significant shift, not in emotional eruption, but in life structure. Hackford did not enter Mirren's life as someone who completed it. He appeared when both had passed through enough failure, enough exhaustion, and understood well enough that neither of them could, or wished to, start over from the beginning. This was not young love, nor a late redemption. It was a meeting in the middle of life, where each arrived carrying a history that could not be erased. What allowed this marriage to endure was not constant romance, but a very clear, unspoken agreement. Neither would be required to soften themselves. Hackford was accustomed to cinematic structures demanding control and discipline. Mirren was accustomed to a professional rhythm that did not permit prolonged vulnerability. They lived together without attempting to dissolve those trajectories into one. There were periods of separation because of work. There were long stretches of living side by side in silence, not from emotional depletion, but because there was no need to prove attachment through words or display. Mirren did not enter marriage as an extension of her public image. She did not use family life to soften her persona, nor did she use love to explain professional choices. The two spaces existed in parallel, occasionally touching, but never required to overlap. What kept them together was not perfect harmony, but the ability to endure difference over time without turning it into a problem that demanded resolution. The decision not to have children was an important part of that life structure. Mirren has said it was a conscious choice, but she has never framed it as a feminist declaration or a lofty philosophical stance. It appears quietly through the way she organizes life. No daily rhythm revolving around child rearing, no family structure demanding constant presence, no sacrifices narrated as moral currency. Instead, there is a life in which attachment is built through dialogue, habit, and the capacity to let another person exist in their own form. Mirren has also never purified her body to fit the moral image the public often expects of older women. She has spoken plainly about alcohol, cigarettes, and physical pleasure, not as rebellion, but as parts of life that need not be concealed. This helps explain why she has never moralized the women she portrays. The body for Mirren is not something that must be cleansed to be worthy of power or love. It is where real life happens, with fatigue, desire, and limits fully intact. As her career stabilized and authority no longer required proof, Mirren's married life emerged as a slower space, unloud, unshowy. Two people walking alongside one another, each carrying their own history without asking the other to lighten it. Love here is not a final destination, but an ongoing process of adjustment, flexible enough to endure and solid enough not to dissolve once the spotlight disappears. In her 70s, Mirren's body is present in a direct way, but without display. She does not conceal age, nor does she turn it into a moral statement. Continuing to work is not about extending a sense of necessity, but about maintaining a familiar habit, arriving on set, completing her part, and leaving. There is no need to hold the center, no need to prove influence. Mirren's current choices keep a rhythm that is hard to name, not contracting after a peak, but not expanding to claim more ground either. Work, marriage, and private space run in parallel without competing. There is no declaration of fulfillment, only a life rhythm arranged long enough to no longer require explanation. There is no moment constructed to frame Helen Mirren as a conclusion. She is remembered through smaller details, the way she enters a rehearsal room without changing the room's tone, the way she waits until the director has finished speaking, the way she keeps a line just sufficient, then lets the space do the rest. For Mirren, technique is not something to be displayed. It resembles the discipline of someone accustomed to demanding systems, where one excess movement can disrupt the rhythm of an entire scene. Those who have worked with her rarely speak of aura, but of ease in a professional sense, arriving on time, preparing thoroughly, not taking up others' space, not turning the set into a place that must worship an individual. In roles requiring weight, she does not raise her voice to demonstrate it. She keeps the voice even, keeps the gaze steady, keeps the body in position. When a scene needs silence, she lets silence remain to its limit, as if trusting that the audience is capable of feeling without being led. One other thing is often repeated in colleagues' recollections. She does not soften herself to be loved, not out of a desire to be difficult, but because she does not regard agreeableness as a condition for respect. When a character is wrong, she does not apologize on the character's behalf. When a character is lonely, she does not turn loneliness into a performance. She allows it to appear through rhythm, through accumulated fatigue, through standing still, while everything around attempts to manufacture an emotional exit. Mirren has never tried to cleanse the body of everyday pleasures. Her openness about alcohol, cigarettes, or desire is not meant to shock, but reflects a consistent way of living, accepting the body as it is, and therefore not forcing her female characters to carry the added burden of self-punishment or permission-seeking in order to exist. Influence thus does not appear in the familiar mode of inspiration. It follows a more practical path. After roles like these, women are written differently. Less explanation, less redemption, allowed to age without being stripped of the right to exist, allowed to hold power without display. Such changes do not need Mirren's name at the top of the page. It is enough to see how female characters are placed in stories and how the stories are able to withstand them, to recognize a deviation that has stayed. One habit has remained unchanged through decades of work, treating work as work to be done, not as a performance of the self. There is no need to list achievements, no impulse to turn private life into justification for professional choices. Only the persistence of someone accustomed to standing under the gaze of others, without granting that gaze the authority to decide who she must become. The working rhythm continues in the same way. Spaces that promise no safety are entered regularly, without preparation for acceptance. A form, shaped over time, is kept intact, stable enough not to adjust to expectation, and clear enough that surrounding structures must consider whether they can contain that presence at all. Helen Mirren exists as a reality already lived, without needing completion, without needing elevation into symbol. What comes after is left to question itself, whether it is solid enough to stand on that ground, or whether it must find another form in order to continue.